So today's topic is about love and relationship. Krishnaji pointed out to us that we don't really know what love means because we use that word with so many different meanings and are quite confused about what it really means. For instance, we say, I love ice cream. What we mean is that it gives me great pleasure to have ice cream. We also say, he loves her so much he can't live one day without her. There, we use word love to mean attachment, dependence. We say, I love the way Ronaldo plays soccer. So we use it to mean admiration for what the skill of a person, whether a musician or a player. The novel says he made love to her. What they mean is that they had sex. So is love attachment? Is love desire? Is love attraction? Is it admiration? Is it devotion? And love of the country means patriotism, which is an identification with your own nation. So we use that word loosely. And in all these meanings, the self is active. It is seeking something for itself, either psychological security or some profit or some pleasure or some gain. And Krishna said, wherever that motive is there, the motive of self-interest, it is not a relationship of love. That love is where the self is not. That means there is no motive of self-interest in that relationship. So what is that relationship for? If it is not for any gain or for obtaining anything for oneself, can there not be relationship just for the joy of sharing, the joy of friendship, in which there is no demand, no other purpose other than the beauty of that relationship itself? So if one is approaching life not as a problem to be solved, but as a mystery to be lived and learned about, then one's approach is not egoistic. But otherwise, the ego is a very subtle beggar, always seeking something for itself in every relationship. And such a relationship is not a relationship of love. It may seem that two people are having a ball because they fit with each other extremely well for a time. That just means that it is based on mutual gratification. But when a relationship is based on mutual gratification, it is like a business relationship, a successful business relationship. It's still not a relationship of love. Most relationship is seeking psychological security. There are three major fears which the human consciousness has. They are imaginary fears. The fear of the future. In response to that, a human being wants to accumulate wealth to ensure that he will never be poor in future. It's a psychological security that it is seeking. The other is the fear of loneliness. To overcome that fear, human beings seek permanence in relationship. And for that, they develop attachment so that the relationship will always be available to them. And the third is the fear of being nobody. If I am nobody, people will just walk over me, not care for me. So man seeks power, position, status, so that people would be afraid of doing that to him or her. All these three drives are drives of the ego, and therefore they have nothing to do with love. Love that Krishnamurti defines as a relationship which is not based on self-interest. It's not that we don't know such relationships. In our hobbies, when you just grow a garden for the love of it, you are not egoistic, you are not ambitious, you are not competing with anybody else. There is no rivalry. But wherever it is an egoistic action, there will be disorder. Because when my self-interest clashes with your self-interest, there will be violence. Either psychological violence or physical violence, that's only a question of the degree of manifestation of the violence. When you are ambitious, if something comes in the way of your ambition, you will brush it aside and it will produce violence. And of course, when you identify with a group or an ideology, you create division, which is the source of all wars and all mischief. So wherever there is the ego, there is bound to be disorder. And since most of our relationships are based on the ego, including the so-called noble relationships of a relationship with God or with your nation, which is regarded as noble. In all of them, there is this element of relating for receiving something in return. And that's not a relationship of love. So we don't know what the relationship, what love really means, unless, as Krishnamurti pointed out, you negate all the other meanings which you have given to the word love. Negate doesn't mean that those things are absent, but that they don't dominate your consciousness. Of course, in all relationships, there is give and take. It doesn't mean there should be no give and take. But if the relationship is based on give and take, then it's a relationship of mutual gratification. So the ego comes in the motive, not in the relationship or in the act of doing or not doing something. The same thing can be done egoistically, and the same act can be performed with love, non-egoistically. And in my talk describing Krishnaji's meaning of the art of living, we pointed out that if you have sensitivity, you do things for the joy of doing it. That joy is innate to that activity. Therefore, you don't seek any other reward out of it or return out of it. That's what we mean also by true friendship, which is also love, where you're not seeking anything from your friend, but there is great joy in sharing your life with your friend. So only if we can find relationships with such motive, or rather have all relationships with such motive, of only the joy of relating, which requires the perception of beauty in that relationship. Not only relationship with people, but also relationship with nature, relationships with knowledge, with ideas. In all of them, if you're not seeking anything for yourself, not being possessive, not seeking status or name or fame for yourself through that relationship, then that relationship is a means to an end. It is not a means to an end. It is an end in itself. And so that is the nature of the relationship of love. Now we all know the energy of ambition, of desire, which are all energy of the ego. It gives great passion in that. But in that passion is destructiveness as well built in. Because if the desire is not fulfilled, there is a feeling of frustration and anger. And if it is fulfilled, then the energy disappears of desire, and therefore there is boredom. So long as there is insensitivity, there is bound to be boredom. And in order to overcome boredom, there is the pursuit of pleasure. So all this which we see going on around us in society or in our own life is a consequence of the egoistic approach. And still, human beings don't realize that the egoistic approach in life is not in their self-interest. They think that acting out of self-interest is in their self-interest. That's an illusion. So the ego is an illusion. It comes about through our approach. It's not part of nature. It's not like an organ in your body, like your stomach or heart or kidney, which nature has put there in your body. So the ego is not permanently there. And that's why it's possible for us to have a relationship in which is not based on the ego or on self-interest. But we give importance to areas in which we are ambitious, where we feel our success lies, and so on. And therefore, we ignore those relationships which are based on love and give importance to those which are seeking fulfillment of the ego. So it's entirely in the approach. And Krishna said the approach to life or to a question matters more than either the question or the answer. Because if the approach is egoistic, the end will be egoistic, which means it will create disorder in consciousness. And if the approach is non-egoistic, then it will not create disorder, because then it's the approach of love. So love demands order in consciousness. And therefore one has to free oneself of the disorder in consciousness. And invariably you will find that all disorder originates from the ego process in consciousness. So ultimately, real freedom is freedom from this ego process within our consciousness. That requires not an opinion that ego process is bad or selfish. That opinion has been given countless number of times in every religion. But it never becomes a fact. It will become a fact only when you perceive it for yourself, the danger of the egoistic approach. So not to avoid the egoistic approach or create an ideal that I should not be egoistic, but to watch it, to learn about it. In watching it in operation in daily life, one may realize that all conflict, all anxiety, all worry, all fear, all sorrow is originating from that approach. So if one sees danger in that approach, the approach will drop away. You don't need to take any decision to drop it away. Just as you don't need to take a decision to get out of the way of a speeding truck on the road, because it's so clear to you the danger of standing in the middle of the road in front of that truck. So when there is perception of danger, there is immediate action. But when you only have an intellectual conviction that it is noble not to be egoistic, that conviction doesn't act. That is not the same as the perception of danger. So that's why the intellectual understanding doesn't transform consciousness. But perception can transform consciousness. And that's what Krishnamurti taught, that perception is real action. That means real change is born of perception. Perception of what is true and what is false, what is healthy and what is harmful. the perception of that in your own daily life will eliminate that which is false, that which creates disorder. Without that perception, all your noble ideas remain only as mental property. And property does not transform consciousness, neither material property nor intellectual property in the form of knowledge and skills and ideas. It does not transform consciousness. In fact, it produces power which can then be used by the ego destructively. We went into that. And tomorrow we will consider that in greater detail when we talk of the learning mind. Because that's the learning to be done. And it can only be done by oneself because that's a learning which cannot come from books or from teachers. You can get ideas, you can get noble thoughts, but you can't get perception from a book or from another teacher. That's why you have to be a light unto yourself. But more about that tomorrow. The egoistic approach is the approach in which one is constantly reacting to one's environment. One is not watching with a view to learn, but one is watching in order to conquer, in order to win over the circumstances and make them more viable, more convenient for oneself, which is basically self-interest. So the egoistic urge converts our mind into a personal lawyer, always defending the me and the mine, and thinking of what is profitable for the me and the mine, the victory of the me and the mine, the propagation of the me and the mine, and therefore it's not seeking truth at all. And therefore the ego is the greatest barrier to self-knowledge or to learning. And as we pointed out, the ego is not part of nature. Anywhere in nature there is no ego. There are, of course, earthquakes and storms which become destructive, but there is no intention in nature to destroy or to help. It is simply following its own laws of the cosmic order. And that's why we don't feel insulted when a dog barks at you or an earthquake comes. We are concerned about how to manage, how to cope with it, but we are not angry because we don't feel insulted. But when a human being barks at you, you jolly well feel insulted. And that insult is then remembered and forms an image about the person who insulted you, and therefore it becomes destructive in relationship. Knowledge of what has happened in the past in the relationship is destructive in relationship. So Krishnaji raised this question. Can you approach every relationship afresh without the knowledge of the past? You would have noticed, if you have watched your friends, that two human beings are both very good friends of yours. They are good human beings as normally assessed, but something goes wrong, and between them, they are not able to live with peace, and therefore they need to separate or divorce each other. Very common situation which one comes across. One has to understand that, because that which happens to your friend can happen to you also, because we share the same consciousness. And it comes from remembering all the hurts of the past. So the question that Krishnamurti raised for relationship was, can you die to the past and relate afresh? Or will the memories of all the hurts and quarrels and pains that you have gone through create an image which becomes a barrier between you and your friend, or your wife, which is also a friend? So can one approach everything like a friend, like a true friend, not seeking anything in that relationship? Relate with the tree, not because it gives you fruit. Relate with the river, not because it gives you electricity or water. Relate with a cow, not because it gives you milk, but relate like a friend because they are coexistent with you and you are sharing your life with them. If that sharing and the joy of sharing is there, which is what is love, then every relationship becomes a source of joy. Your relationship with your servant, with your wife and children, with your neighbor, with nature. And there may be pleasure or pain in that relationship, sorrow, that's accepted as a part of life to be learned from. Not resisted, not escaped from, because you are wanting to learn about life, the mystery of life. But unfortunately, we have not been approached, we have not been trained to approach life with a learning mind. We have learned to approach life with a reactive mind. And so we form permanent enmities, and that enmity, that hatred stays with you, doesn't die. If you will recall your childhood, or if you have watched children, you will see that they quarrel. But next day, they are going hand in hand. They have forgotten that quarrel. They don't carry that bitterness. You and I were that child at one time. But now it becomes impossible. Somebody hurts you, and you remember that hurt, and you can't make friends with him again. It's finished. Permanent enmities result from it. That's what the ego does. And the ego comes with this crystallization of the memories of the pains and pleasures from the past. So Krishna said, can you die every day to the happenings of that day? Neither record the flattery nor the insult. You can't do that with a decision. But if you have seen the consequence of being flattered and being insulted, the consequence in life, either in your friend's life or in your own life, and if you have learned about it, it may drop away because you know the danger of these psychological memories. Otherwise, they form permanent images, and we relate to each other through that image, not directly. You don't see your wife directly as she is today. You see her through all the yesterdays and all the memories on the images that you have formed about her, and she about you. And that becomes destructive in relationships. So it's important to die every day. To die every day means to die to the ego, which is the same as a relationship of love. So love has great kinship with death, not physical death, which comes at the end of life, but death of the ego. So love and death are closely related to each other. But we have been taught to remember and to use memory as a safeguard for the future, which is the demand for psychological security. This demand for psychological security is a deep-rooted motivation which is there in human beings because we are capable of imagining insecurity in the future. An animal is not. He sees danger in the present, but he can't imagine danger in the future. He sees insecurity in the future, he feels the hunger, the pain, but he's not worried about next year's pain. But the tragedy of the human being is that even though I have no pain and no danger right now, I'm worried about tomorrow and 1,000 tomorrows. And that's a psychological fear, a psychological pain. And all that constitutes the ego, which destroys love. So one has to understand all this deeply and free oneself of such motivations if one really wants to discover a relationship of love. It's not just a relationship of love, it's really a state of being. Love is a state of consciousness, a state of mind in which all disorder has ended because there is no ego motive in that consciousness. And so all relationships will be affected by it, not just the relationship to your wife and children, but all relationships will be affected by it because you will approach life differently. Not always approach it like a beggar, asking something for yourself. And then if you don't get it, crying, feeling frustrated. That's how a child reacts. And we react the same way. Only our toys are different and the child's toy is different. Our toys are what we call our jobs, our promotion, and so on. Those are our toys. And if you don't get it, you cry. So we are not, adults are literally grown-up children. We are same as the children, but our toys have changed. It's more difficult. The adult life is more difficult because the ego has crystallized. A child is not egoistic. Gradually becomes more and more egoistic, partly because of the adults around, because he grows up in imitation of the adults. So it's also our responsibility, because if we are egoistic, it corrupts our child, his life also. But we don't realize that that is corruption. we don't know that ego is corruption. We think ego is protective. Ego leads to victory for myself and so on, success for myself. So we choose ambition. Also because we are not aware of the energy of love. So we think if we had no ambition, if we had no desire, we would just go under, become lazy, sleep off. There would be no reason to do anything. But if you have discovered the energy of love, which means sensitivity, which means the joy of togetherness, of relating, sharing, then that sustains the relationship. And that is a relationship of love. Not towards one person or one particular relationship, but when that is your inner state, then it will affect all your relationships. So that's what he taught. It's not easy, but I'm not sure we have seriously attempted it. He wanted us to be serious about all this, not just listen to him, agree with him, and so on. But he said, what I'm pointing out, I'm pointing to a truth, but you have to realize that truth in your own life. And that is the work which we have to do in order to discover what really that state of love is. Otherwise, you can keep talking about it, discussing it, holding dialogues about it, but never come upon it directly, because all this talk is verbal, intellectual. It only has the value of creating the question and communicating the question, but it has not the value of revealing the truth. But relationship can reveal the truth if you have a learning mind. And in that relationship, you are learning, watching, and perceiving every day. More about that tomorrow when we discuss the learning mind. Thank you. I'll end it here.
Thank you, Professor Krishna. Now we have the question and answer period starting. And I will begin with the question from Ruth Fisher and Walter Wiesman. In his wonderful notebook, J.K. speaks of a powerful unknown something that comes close to him. Is there a description of that? Professor Krishna, did you talk with J.K. on this?
No, he didn't talk about that with anybody. Occasionally, there were people who were with him when he went into that state, and he talked about, do you feel the presence of it now in the room? It's throbbing and so on. And some people felt it. I have read these accounts. But that didn't communicate. That was part of what is called the process. And that's a great mystery about Krishnamurti, which nobody knew what it was. And he didn't talk about it in great detail. He said to me towards the end of his life, sir, there are things I am not permitted to tell. I didn't ask him who is not permitting you, but apparently he must have taken some vows in boyhood or whatever. And so there is great mystery about all that. He called it the other. And he received that. If you want in greater detail about all this, you should read the book, The Inner Life of Krishnamurti by Aryal Sanat. He was a professor of philosophy in Washington, D.C. He studied about Krishnamurti and then wrote the book. The book is sold by the foundations. But nobody knows what that is. I have talked to people who are very close to him, and they don't know about it. There's also a book by Mark Lee, not his own version, but he has produced all the facts about the events that took place during these periods where Krishnamurti was in touch with the other. That's all that I know.
We have a question from Catherine Jones. Discrimination is important to survival and living. Isn't memory of the past necessary for discrimination?
That's what we normally think, because that's what the ego tells us. That's what is the psychological fear, that if I don't discriminate and I have contact with evil people, then I will face danger or insults or tragedy. So you want to avoid those people and have discrimination. It is the desire to be more comfortable, more safe. It's not a learning mind. A learning mind would use that fear to learn about oneself, because that fear also is arising from somewhere within our consciousness. And it's important for us to free ourselves of fear. Otherwise, you are busy all the time coping with that fear. And it's a psychological fear. It's not a real fear. Real fear is, like right now, Putin is bombarding Ukraine. That's real fear. The next missile can kill you. That's physical danger. But in imagination, what was that saying by Shakespeare? Cowards die several times before their death. So it's like that. So Krishnaji's suggestion is not going to make you comfortable. He is going to disturb you, because you can learn from that disturbance. You have to learn from that disturbance. He was asked this question, not in so many words, but in some other context, that what you say is not comforting. And he said that if you had cancer, would you like your doctor to give you aspirin, or would you like him to operate? So if you come to me, I operate on you. It will produce some amount of pain, but that's part of the operation. If you're seeking comfort, you have to go to somebody else. When you are non-violent, you are vulnerable. And you see that in the case of the Tibetans, no? They were very non-violent people. The Dalai Lama was their leader. And the Chinese simply occupied and Dalai Lama ran away to India and took shelter in India. So a journalist asked him, "You are the leader of Tibet. Your people, your country has been occupied by the Chinese and your people are being tortured. You have run away from there and sought shelter in a neighboring country. Under these conditions, how can you be so happy? Because you see on his face great happiness and joy." And his reply is very significant. He said, "See, there are only two possibilities. Either you can do something about it, then go and do it. Or nothing can be done, then that's also all right." In other words, life doesn't have to come according to your wishes to comfort you. Life is coming that way. You learn to face life. Either you go and fight and do what you can to change the circumstances, or you can't, then that's also all right. Life doesn't have to come according to your wishes. That's what is the implication of his statement.
We have a question from Prasad Mulupuri. Sir, why does JK want us to die to all memories, both pleasant and unpleasant, of the past in relationships? What is the harm if I remember the help received and feel grateful and act from that memory?
I don't think you can be so selective about memories. So either you see the danger of those memories and don't give importance to them, or you will have both the memories of the pleasure and the pain, the flattery and the insults, both. And your relationship will then be affected by these images. So it becomes complicated. The relationship becomes complicated. It doesn't remain simple. You must have observed in marriages that a quarrel begins on some small issue and it takes a big form because all those memories come up, that 2 years ago you treated me like this, at that time you did this, and so on. And the other person comes up with his own or her own memories, and so on. And it becomes a war. It begins with a small, simple issue, which can be solved. But with all this complication which comes from the ego holding to these memories in the consciousness, it becomes like a big war. That's the danger. But of course, you can't decide. I mean, the brain does its work of remembering. I can't decide what to remember, what not to remember. But I can perceive the danger of remembering. And that perception may prevent the brain from remembering, or may not. There is no guarantee that that will happen. But if you don't think about it and don't watch it, nothing will change. That is guaranteed. That's why it's extremely difficult for a human being to change. It's easy to talk about it, but actually you will find that very few human beings really change. I'll send you a short video. I'll send it to Mr. Rao and he can send it to you, where Krishnamurti has talked about this, the difficulty of why human beings can't change. It's on YouTube, so I'll just send you the link.
The next question is from Kusra Farazban. Thank you, sir. Does sitting quiet and silent for a few minutes every night before sleeping and dying to everything that happened that day have any value? I know Kay was always against the system, method, or a habit, but if one does this not as a habit, but seriously and passionately every night, does it have any value?
It has value if one does it with a learning mind, but it does not have value if one does it with an achieving mind. Trying to achieve something makes the approach egoistic. But if you are doing it because you want to learn about it, what happens when you do this? There is no harm in practicing a technique. There is a misunderstanding that Krishnaji was against techniques. It's not true. He was against techniques which were practiced egoistically in order to achieve something. But he was not against experimentation. So he himself did yoga and pranayama every day for 1.5 to 2 hours. And he took weights exercises for the eyes and so on. So it's not true that he did not practice techniques, but not in order to achieve something, just to keep the body healthy and so on. So he never propagated it as necessary. He talked about self-knowledge being necessary. But keeping the body fit is part of that. And keeping the mind fit. So he has talked about noting down your thoughts at the end of the day and so on as part of the exercises of self-knowledge for learning. More about that tomorrow.
Now, Urmi Kapdi asks, can two persons of completely different tendencies be good friends? One an introvert and the other an extrovert? How did Kay deal with the people like Rajagopal?
I don't know how he dealt with Rajgopal because it's not possible to enter into the consciousness of another person and feel what that person has felt. But what I know from my interaction with him regarding Rajgopal, which I have put in my book, was that he was quite open to talking to him and willing to settle things with him and so on. But there was considerable resistance and ego on the part of Rajgopal because he was not a free person. And he must have had his own reasons for being antagonized and being against him. But I don't know. It's not possible to answer these questions about somebody else's relationships.
The next question is from T. Havdarova. Could you please elaborate on the notion of passion? It is often mistaken for desire. You likened it to enthusiasm, but isn't there something stronger and more specific? Is it a driving force?
See, normally, we are only aware of the passion that comes from the ego. That's what we have frequently experienced right from childhood, and so we are familiar with it. But Krishnamurti talks of a passion which is not from the ego, and one saw that in his life. He was not leading an egoistic life, and yet he did so much work with such alertness and such passion. If you read his biography, you will find extraordinary amount of work that he has achieved with all these schools and foundations and going around the world, teaching all the people, not for anything for himself. He didn't take money, nor did he build up anything for himself. So why did he do all that? So obviously it is possible to have that kind of passion. And that's what the Buddha and Jesus Christ and such people, they lived that kind of life. They didn't act out of the ego. So obviously there is passion which is not from the ego, but it is rare to find that because most of us are trapped in the ego process. And it takes a lot of learning to come out of it because it's a very deep-seated habit. It's a stronger addiction than that of alcohol or smoking and so on. The addiction to this kind of thinking, egoistic thinking. And we are trained into this egoistic thinking and it becomes an addiction. And this is what I think, and this is not what Krishnamurti said. But one could see that very few people could come out of this ego state in spite of having heard Krishnamurti and interacted with him seriously for years together. So obviously, it's not something that is easy for human beings to achieve as an achievement. But perhaps right from the beginning, if education is changed and does not promote the ego in the child, we might create a different generation of people who are not so egoistic as the people we find today. At present, all education in every country promotes the ego in the child, not aware of the danger of doing that. And the kind of society that we are seeing around us is the creation of all this. I'm not saying that it is guaranteed that with a different kind of education, it will completely change things. I once asked Krishnamurti that question. I said, sir, if a child is brought up the way you have pointed out, will he grow up to be free? And he said that question cannot be answered because it has never been tried. Very true answer. The experiment has never been done. Therefore, the result cannot be announced, is what he is saying. A very scientific statement. So he included his own schools in that. They were attempting to create the atmosphere he wanted, but none of the schools has completely succeeded in creating that atmosphere because the child needs the mind of the teachers. And the teachers come from society completely conditioned. They don't meet the mind of Krishnamurti. So it's not simple. And so he advocated that the teachers as well as the students should be learning together in what goes on in the schools. Not that the teachers know and the children learn from them. The teachers also need to learn together. So it's a very different approach to education. But whether that would succeed, I don't know. I don't think there is any guarantee. And when I asked him that, he said, if that's the right thing to do, that's what we should be doing. Whether it succeeds or not is not our concern. So that's another thing to learn. That what we consider to be right and wrong, the businessman and the politician's definition is that which leads to success is right, that which brings failure to the mission is wrong. That's not the religious definition of right and wrong. The religious definition of right and wrong is not based on the result. It's based on the motive with which you are acting now. If that motive is egoistic, it's wrong action. If that motive is out of love, not ego, then it is right action even if it fails. And it's wrong action even if it succeeds, if it is egoistic. So I have a question for you, which we have all often discussed in our dialogues, which is connected with this. We have read about the life of the Buddha. He was a prince, very comfortable in the kingdom. He saw no pain, no sorrow, and so on. Ultimately, one day he goes out, sees suffering and sorrow and pain and disease, and this question strikes him: what is the cause of sorrow? And is that all there is to life? Or can one end that sorrow? And that question troubled him so much that he leaves his palace, his wife and child, and goes off into the forest. Then joins a group of yogis, finds that it does not change answer his questions. So he goes further and so on. Now the question is, was it right action when he was leaving his wife and child and going off into the forest, or was it wrong action? Is it right because ultimately he found enlightenment? And if he had not found enlightenment, we would have just regarded him as a wayward, selfish man who left his wife and child, didn't care for them. How can something that happened later on, namely enlightenment, define whether that action was right or wrong? When the action was performed, what was the motive with which it is performed? If he was doing it in order to escape from the troubles and tribulations of family life, then it was a selfish action, wrong action. If he was doing it because his concern was to find the answer for the sorrow of humanity, and that would include his wife and child, then it was right action. And who knows what was the motive with which he did that. So the religious definition of right and wrong is that any action which is performed from a state of love and compassion is right action, even if it fails. And any action which is done egoistically, motive, is wrong action, even if it succeeds outwardly. The result afterwards doesn't determine whether it was right or wrong.
We have a question from Taj. Sir, is there love when there is no passion? Is there love when there is duality in the relationship?
Such love is just the absence of self-centered motive. It doesn't mean that you will not have sex or you will not have pleasure, but that you are not engaging in that relationship, seeking that pleasure for yourself. So you can have sex and you can do sex with great love, or you can do it with lust. If you do it with lust, it is wrong action. If you do it with love, it is right action. It has nothing to do with whether you can do sex or not do sex. So all action can be done egoistically, and the same action can be done non-egoistically. It's the motive that determines whether it's egoistic or not. So you have to watch the motive and learn about the effect of the motive. That's why Krishnamurti says the approach matters more than what you do or not do. The approach is egoistic or it is non-egoistic. The ego is a reactive mind and the non-egoistic is a learning mind. More about that tomorrow.
And the question from Kartik Gupta. Old hurts do not die and stop relationships. Why is ego so stubborn?
There is no such thing as ego. It's not something that like your organ which nature has put there. It's just a habit of thought. We create that through identification and separating ourselves as Hindu or Indian or Theosophist or Krishnamurti person and so on. All identification, whether it's with ideology or with philosophy or with nation or with religion or belief, all identification is isolating, separating yourself from other human beings and creates division. Why does a human being do that? Because he feels that there is safety in that identification. It is true that if you join a church and become part of that community, you feel brotherly within the church, and that becomes your community and you feel safe, you feel they will help you and you will help them and so on. So you have a large number of friends. It's the same for a man in India joining a caste. That caste becomes his community and he feels safe in belonging to that caste. But when you look a little further, you will see that other people join other castes for the same reason, and that it divides you from them. And that division is the cause of all the insecurity and all the rioting and the wars in the world. So the feeling of security is an illusion. It's false. It's not really producing security, but you don't know that because when you see only this far, you feel that it is giving you security or safety. That's why it is necessary to stay with the question and not quickly answer it or accept an answer from someone. Because these matters are subtle and it will not become clear unless you stay with the question for a long time. So Krishnaji said, the answer does not lie outside the question. It lies in the question. You have to investigate the question and you may find the answer or you may not. But if you don't investigate, you won't find the answer being the truth. And truth lying at the level of perception, not simply ideation.
Now we have a question from Sumitra Gautama. There is such wisdom in your words, Professor Krishna. Have you had an experience that dissolved your ego?
I don't think that there is a particular experience that dissolves the ego. It's a continual learning and watching. The ego can always form again because all the raw material that is needed for forming the ego is present. All it needs is memory, capacity for imagination and thinking, and the instinct of seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. All of which are always present even in Krishnamurti or in the Buddha. So the religious texts say that the devil is always walking by the side of the Buddha. And if the Buddha's awareness lapses, he'll catch hold of him and create the ego and destroy him. So it is your alertness and your watchfulness, your awareness, which enables you to keep your consciousness free from the ego. I'm not saying that I am free from the ego completely, but when the ego comes up occasionally, it's an opportunity to learn about oneself. And that's what the learning mind is. That's what Krishnamurti taught. It's not that the learning has ended. It can come up again. It's like a forest fire. A forest fire begins like a small little fire. If it is noticed immediately, very easy to stop, to put your foot down and end it. But when it grows and becomes a big fire, it becomes a problem for the whole town to put it out. In the same way, the ego starts as a small little happening in your consciousness. And if you notice immediately, you can end it. But if you let it develop and grow, it becomes a big addiction or something, then it becomes very difficult to eliminate. Therefore, that passive awareness, constant passive awareness, what the Dalai Lama people call mindfulness, living in the present, mindful of your motives and so on, is the way that somebody can keep himself from falling into the trap of the ego. Otherwise, the trap always exists. There is no permanent freedom.
And now a question from Sam. Sir, how do we distinguish between the energy of ego and the energy of passion when they emanate from the same source, the conditioned mind?
the energy is the same. When it is used egoistically, it will produce disorder. And disorder in the form of negative emotions in the consciousness is very visible because it produces pain, it produces conflict, it produces fear and sorrow, which are very noticeable. So if you keep watching your consciousness, you know whether things are going wrong and you are turning egoistic or not. Whether the energy is egoistic or it is coming out of a feeling of love and compassion. Very noticeable. If it is out of love and compassion, there is no disorder in consciousness. So every time you notice disorder in consciousness, it's an opportunity to learn about yourself and the formation of some ego in your consciousness.
We have a question from Taj. Sir, how can one go beyond relationship duality into union without being in meditation?
All this learning is part of meditation, but it's not the other way around. It's not that meditation creates this learning. Then you practice some meditation and that itself becomes an escape. Like going to the temple or church can become an escape and so on. So you have to be very watchful that you are not really escaping from the problems, that you are really learning and freeing yourself of the ego motive in you. That is, if you want to do that, if you are quite satisfied with being egoistic and being successful, go ahead. I mean, nobody is asking you to necessarily do this, but if you are interested in a religious life, then you will have to learn this.
The next question is from Sumitra Gautama. Is love then an unraveling, or what remains when the ego suffers destruction? How does one uncover it in one's life?
You see, the ego comes in the manner in which I am approaching something. So if I don't approach that way, it's not there. It's not as if the ego is some solid entity put there by nature. It is just, it comes about in the manner in which I am thinking and approaching that relationship. If I am seeking something for myself out of that relationship, it becomes egoistic approach. If I am not seeking anything other than the joy that is innately there in relating, then it's not egoistic. So the ego is my own creation. And if I learn about that and become aware of the danger of the ego, it will cease because I will not approach. Nature has put an intelligence into us which doesn't let us court danger. But if you are tempted and you court danger, it means you are not aware of the danger. Therefore, you do it. And that unawareness is the ignorance. But if you are watchful and you won't approach that way because you don't need a decision to not go near danger. If there is a fire, you don't go near it. There is no temptation. The very fact that there is a temptation and you are deciding not to be tempted, that conflict comes only because there is lack of clarity. So find out what is that lack of clarity and become clear in your mind. That's all.
And now a question from Kauser Pasha. Sir, can I become a good school teacher as Krishnamurti meant, or it is just a thing, or isn't a thing to become?
You have to first find out whether you really love children and you enjoy relating with them, teaching them, engaging with them. You can't force yourself to do that. But if it's in your inner nature and that's what you enjoy doing, you can become a good teacher. You can read books about it, and learning can be a joy. Learning doesn't have to be a punishment or an achievement. It doesn't have to be brought about through fear and competition and rivalry and so on, as it is being done today. Learning can be a joyous process.
We now have a question from Pedro Ramos. Is love a threat to the ego? And is that why, when we see a glimpse of it, we react to it with fear?
Depends on what you're calling love. If you're desiring a woman and you call that love, it's not love. It is ego. You are seeking fulfillment for your sexual desires, or maybe for your emotional desires. So that's not really love, but you call it love. And that creates a confusion. They don't coexist. Ego and the egoistic motive, if it is there, it is not a relationship of love. Love has no opposite. But attachment has an opposite. If attachment is not fulfilled, it will create fear. It will create hatred, the opposite of that. But love has no opposite.
I will now read a question from Catherine Jones. Ego is a poor master, but a good servant. Isn't it better to just step back and see the ego as a servant to truth, or that principle that lies beyond the ego?
You know, the word ego has been used with very different meanings by different people. And the theosophists have called ego with a capital E, which I don't know what it means, and so on. So it's just a word, but I'm using the word ego to mean self-interest. If your motive, you are acting out of self-interest, it is not an act of love. That's all. But if you have some other meaning for ego, then I don't know.
And we have a question. This is the last question we currently have from Shankar Rao. Is it not the ego which helps us to understand ego and then live with it but without any influence of ego in me.
Yes, that's why it is not important to suppress the ego or avoid it. If the ego is forming in your consciousness, it will create disorder. You can watch that disorder and know the consequence of the ego. And that's how you will become aware of the danger of the ego. But we often form an opinion before coming upon the perception of the danger. And the opinion does not transform consciousness. So you will not be able to free unless you come upon perception. And you come upon perception by staying with the question, not by escaping from the question or discarding the question or suppressing the desire to investigate the question. So it needs a lot of patience and a lot of humility to be able to learn. But that's part of the learning mind, and we'll talk about it tomorrow in greater detail.
And a question from Catherine Jones. Isn't ego the identification with body and mind?
Yes, of course. Just as there is identification with religious belief or with ideology, political ideology, or with nation, there is also the identification with one's own body and one's own conditioning, which is one's own mind. That's what I call as I, the me. So one has to go deeply into this question of who am I? When I am asked that question, who are you? I give various answers. Sometimes I just say I'm Krishna. But that just is a name that was given to me at birth. At other times I say I'm a Hindu. But that's not me. That's just the religion of the family I was brought up in. Sometimes I say I'm an Indian. That means I was born in a part of the world which is today called India, that has been expanding and shrinking over time, depending on which king won or ruled over what area. But if in that identification you invest and you derive psychological importance from that, that constitutes the ego. Otherwise, it's only factual. It is true that I was born in a Hindu family, which was part of the Theosophical Society. And it is true that I have an Indian passport. But that in itself is not ego. The fact doesn't create the ego. But if I invest in that fact psychologically and derive importance and status from it and so on, security, then it constitutes the ego. So the ego is a process within our consciousness. It's not created by any factual thing. You can be very egoistic about your wealth, or you may have wealth and not be egoistic about it. So it's not the wealth that creates the ego. It is you who create the ego in relation to the wealth. And similarly to the wife or to religion or whatever.
Thank you, Professor Krishna. So now we have come to the completeness of our session. And we have no more questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for your patience. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you, Krishna.
See you.